Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. Let's dive into a story about a young worker who stood her ground against an entitled boss who undervalued his employees and paid less than minimum wage. When pushed to quit her second job to cater to his whims, she refused, facing unjust retaliation. Years later, karma delivered its verdict, and she thrived in her career, witnessing her ex-boss's fall from grace. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. My entitled boss fired me for not wanting to quit my second job. I am 36-year-old female, but this happened when I was 18. Things may seem off, but remember this was the early 2000s. That time was a crazy time. For this, I'll call my boss main boss, EB for entitled boss, and second boss, NB for nice boss. When I was 18, my 37-year-old male, EB, was a tyrant. He lived life on easy mode. College was cheap for him, and he didn't have to pay because his dad could cover it. His business was even started on him having advantages over his employees in life. He couldn't see that, though, because he felt he worked for it. He did not get how his millennial employees were struggling with what we were paid. We were getting paid $5 an hour, which I know for a fact was below minimum wage at the time. I didn't complain, though, because I needed a job. Living in New York is expensive, but it's hard to leave New York when your family is broke. At the time, I just started college. He knew that and agreed to me having Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off so I can go to school and have at least one day to myself. I needed to save towards paying off student loans and eventually getting my own place. My parents were not bad, but could not afford paying for me to go to college and covering basic expenses. Lucky for me, I did get a scholarship and grants, but it did not cover everything, so I needed a job. Part of my money went to household expenses and my needs, along with attempting to save for my future. So I got this job. I thought since my boss agreed to this and was younger, I wouldn't have issues. I thought it would be okay, but I was wrong. My EB worked the younger employees to the bone. We only had 10-minute breaks for meals and barely got any time for ourselves. Bathroom trips were even timed. He had no sympathy. Even if a woman was pregnant, we were scared of upsetting him because he would go from friendly to crazy at the drop of a dime. One girl who worked there quit. She wanting more than one day to bury her grandmother. He told her, "Why are you crying? Your grandma was old. When I lost my grandparents, I didn't even take a day off. I just kept working. Kids now are too sensitive. The real world isn't going to coddle you, sweetheart. One day or you're fired." She tossed her name badge at him and left. That girl was brave. I noticed that even with my regular hours, I was struggling to get by, so I looked for small gigs I can do on my work days that wouldn't conflict with my work hours. So I found one that worked. I worked part-time at a small craft store in my neighborhood. It was after my main job hours and by my house. My main job was like 7-Eleven, by the way. I kept it hush because I knew if this guy knew I was working somewhere else, he would get mad that I requested 3 days off during the week. However, a regular of our store let it slip while she thanked me. He knew now that I was working at the craft store as well, so the EB had a meltdown. During my break, he called me to the office. He demanded I quit my second job to be on call for my main one. He wanted me to work longer hours, but wouldn't give me a raise or overtime to compensate for the extra time I might have been working, which was not guaranteed, by the way. I needed guaranteed money. So what incentive did I have to quit my second job? I needed extra money. My NB was paying $6.50 for 3 hours, 4 days a week. When I said, no, I need the job for basic expenses, my EB said, "Don't you live with your parents? Kind of pathetic. What expenses do you have? When I was your age, I already had my first home and was paying a mortgage. You just work here and go to college. Wait till you have to pay a mortgage and take care of kids. So you either quit or you're fired." I was annoyed. He was not paying me extra. He was not entitled to my time. He used up my only break to tell me to be broke because he thinks I'm leeching off my parents. I said, "No, EB, I will not quit. If you aren't giving me steady hours or a pay increase, why should I leave my second job?" I don't know why he didn't get I'm an adult. I had to pay towards my student loans, my phone, transportation, and food. He had no sympathy, and after that shift, he fired me. He expected me to bend to him, but I didn't. He was an a-hole and made my life hell even after I was fired. I couldn't even put that place on my resume because if I did, he would tell potential employers I'm lazy and stole food. So I put the NB, 55-year-old female at the time, as my previous manager. She was a much nicer person. I told her what happened. She gave me a little more hours at the craft store, and that helped till the end of the semester. When I was looking for work, she gave me a good recommendation. She was the sweetest woman. R.I.P. Leanne. I had to pause my education because it took a while to get a new job. I needed to save up to continue. Eventually found a better paying job at a clinic. My NB wished me good luck in my future. Years later, I was about 28, and I see this guy's store for sale. I was so happy when I saw that guy's store shut down. I asked around, and my old coworker said nobody wanted to work for him because he was such a jerk. He started hiring undocumented workers and got in trouble for that. His wife left him for cheating on her with a 20-year-old. He got fined so much he had to sell his home just to cover the fines and alimony. Apparently, he moved in with his parents. I laughed because this guy gave me hell for living with my parents. He was now divorced and living off his parents. This was hilarious. So the universe was saying, here you go, girl. I saw it as karma. I was told I could sue him, but at the time I really didn't have the time or money to do that. But fate made this man feel it in the end, so I let it all go and moved forward. Now I'm in my own place with my loving partner. I'm almost the same age as my EB was when I was fired. God knows I'll never treat kids the way EB treated me. The way EB's arrogance and entitlement completely backfired on him is a chef's kiss moment. This guy clearly thought he was invincible, dictating your life, belittling your struggles, and making your workplace a living hell. And for what? Just to end up back at square one, living with his parents and losing everything he built? Meanwhile, OP not only bounced back, but thrived. From enduring that nightmare job to becoming a pastry chef in Manhattan, the growth is inspiring. And let's not forget NB, who was the polar opposite of EB, supportive, kind, and genuinely helpful. She's proof that good people in your corner can make all the difference. Karma hit EB like a freight train, and honestly, it's hard not to feel satisfied about it. And our next story. How I helped my grandparents defend their property from a vengeful neighbor. A while back, my grandparents, who've lived peacefully in their suburban home for decades, got new neighbors. It was a young family, a husband, wife, and 2 teenage kids. At first, they seemed okay. The husband introduced himself to my grandfather, mentioning he worked as a corrections officer with odd hours due to his shifts. My grandparents, being friendly and welcoming as always, had no reason to suspect trouble. But things went south fast. It started when my grandparents noticed the neighbors had taken down the shared section of the backyard fence without asking. They apparently decided the fence was too old and ugly, so they tore it down and replaced it with a new one, built entirely on my grandparents' property line, without permission. When my grandfather brought this up, politely pointing out that they'd installed the new fence 2 feet into his yard, the husband brushed him off. It's just a fence, what's the big deal? When my grandfather asked them to move it to the correct line, the guy got snippy, saying, "You're retired. What do you even care about 2 feet of grass?" My grandfather, ever the gentleman, didn't escalate things. Instead, he hired a surveyor, confirmed the boundary lines, and sent the neighbor a formal notice asking them to fix the issue, but they refused, doubling down on their entitlement. That's when my grandfather had no choice but to go through the city. An inspector came out, and the neighbors were ordered to move the fence or face fines. The neighbors complied, but barely. They moved the fence back, but their attitude shifted from entitled to outright hostile. The husband, already irritated by being shown up, decided to make my grandparents' life miserable. The first act of retaliation, throwing a huge late-night party that lasted until 4 a.m., complete with blaring music and drunken shouting. When my grandparents asked them to turn it down, the wife snapped, "This is our house and we'll do what we want." Then the real harassment began. One morning, my grandparents woke up to find their flower beds destroyed, plants ripped out of the soil and scattered all over the yard. A week later, a grapefruit came flying through their living room window. They called the police each time, but there was no proof of who was behind it. Still, it was obvious. The most egregious act? Someone dragged the community dumpster from the alley and dumped it into their pool. The cleanup alone took days. Every incident felt more personal, more malicious, and more frustrating. After the pool incident, I stepped in. I wasn't about to let these jerks terrorize my grandparents. I started digging into the husband's background, focusing on his job at the corrections facility. After a few phone calls, I got in touch with the warden. I laid out the situation, explaining how this man, a supposed corrections officer, was threatening and harassing my elderly grandparents. The warden took the complaint seriously and promised to investigate. A few days later, the husband showed up at my grandparents' door again. This time he was furious. "You think you can mess with my life?" he shouted, pounding on the door. When my grandfather answered, the guy got in his face, threatening him again. I was there this time, and I had my phone out, recording the entire thing. When I stepped in, his anger turned on me, yelling that I'd regret making trouble for him. As he stormed off, he muttered something about how he wasn't going to hit me because it's not worth losing my job. That line turned out to be very ironic. Armed with video evidence, I went back to the warden and shared everything: the threats, the harassment, and the footage of him screaming at my grandparents. A week later, 2 officials from the state corrections department visited my grandparents to get a full account. My grandparents shared everything: the vandalism, the threats, the sleepless nights. I backed it up with my video and the police reports. It turned out this guy had a history of temper issues and disciplinary problems. He'd been transferred to this facility after nearly being fired from another. This was his last chance, and he blew it. The corrections department terminated his employment not long after we saw foreclosure notices appear on their door. They packed up and left in the middle of the night. The best part, the new neighbors who moved in are wonderful. A friendly couple in their 40s, they own a small cafe in town and have brought over pastries and homemade soup for my grandparents. They've taken the time to chat and even helped my grandfather fix an old birdhouse near the fence line. They planted flowers along the shared boundary, making the yard feel brighter and more welcoming. Unlike the nightmare neighbors before, these two are respectful and genuinely kind. My grandparents finally feel at peace and even look forward to little visits and treats from their new neighbors. The audacity of this guy. Imagining a corrections officer who thinks his badge doubles as a license for bullying and all over a fence he put in the wrong place. It's so satisfying how his arrogance came full circle, getting fired after all his harassment, and how poetic that his new replacement neighbors brought kindness and light to your grandparents' lives. That's karma working overtime. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.